Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to jump right into it. I have a lot of material to cover. I know this is one of the hot topics, facilities and inspection. Everybody loves this. So for the next 20 minutes, we're going to talk about the goals of the facility assessment within your applications. What's the difference between a facility and a process that Chid just talked about? There's subtle differences. What goes into our risk-based decisions in our facility assessments, how we come about our PAI decisions, and our outcomes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the back end of the PAI as opposed to the PAI itself. Different types of information requests. Our office has one additional information request that we can send out outside of the IR. And then we're going to wrap it up with some examples of the facility recommendations. So you might ask yourself, why this facility requirement? Why do we pay attention to facilities? Well, it's in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that we cannot approve an application to market if the facilities and controls are considered adequate. So how do we determine an adequacy of a facility? So some of our goals are, we look at the manufacturing risk from a GMP perspective. So our division is a little unique in that we go outside of the application. So we're looking at some of the inspectional history of each facility and considering that facility's ability to implement the proposed process in the application. We also determine whether or not a PAI is to be conducted. We collaborate with all our other review team members. We are closely collaborate with the process reviewer. And then finally, we make the final commercial decision for each facility listed in the application. So what's the difference between a facility review and a process review? Well, the process review is examining the appropriateness of the design and the control strategy of the manufacturing process that's listed in the application or outlined in the application. And the facility assessment is examining that facility's ability to implement that control strategy within their quality management systems. So basically, how does that facility maintain the control strategy over the life cycle of the drug product? So they're complementary with each other, and together they provide a comprehensive assessment of the manufacturing operations proposed in the submission. So I want to take you and put you at our desk for the next couple of minutes. And what we're actually going to do when you list facilities in the applications. So what we're going to do is going to break down your 356H, and I know there's been a lot of questions, and now the next slide I can hopefully answer some of those. And we're going to look at your Module 3, both for the drug substance facilities you've listed and the drug product facilities that you've listed. And we're going to put them into our risk-based model, and I'll go into detail about each of the risks that we've identified for each facility. So from our office, what we're going to concentrate on are the proposed commercial facilities. So that's your finished dosage manufacturers, your API manufacturers, any controlled testing facility that tests either the finished product or the API, does stability testing, and the primary packagers. So we don't necessarily formally evaluate the supporting facilities, but I don't want to say that we don't evaluate them. It's kind of on a case-by-case basis. So as you can see with like an exhibit batch manufacturer, if it's not proposed for commercial operations, we might not formally evaluate it, but if we have inspectional history, maybe there's data integrity issues at that exhibit batch manufacturing operations, we might want to go take a closer look. So a PAI could happen at that facility. Excipient manufacturers, I know this was discussed earlier. Generally, we don't formally evaluate those, but they could come into play if they're a novel excipient that we don't have a lot of history about in our systems about, or it's involved in a critical step in the process. And we would collaborate with the process reviewers and the drug product reviewers who are looking at the formulations to make that determination. I do want to note that all of these sites are required to meet statutory GMP requirements and are subject to inspections, even though we don't formally evaluate them. So let's go into the risk assessment. So for each facility that you list in your application, we're going to break it down, do a risk-based approach to evaluate them. And those three risks are the facility risk, the process risk, and the product risk. So in the facility risk, we're basically, what is the firm's compliance status? So we're going to look at the previous inspectional history and the outcomes. What might have happened 10 years ago isn't necessarily as important as what happened in the last time, but we can look at all the inspection history over the years. Are you continually in and out of compliance? Did you not adequately correct the violations that we identified 6 years ago and they repeated again 2 years ago? That would increase your risk. Also, is there confidence that the firm can maintain quality operations given their commitments? So related to the product that you're proposing in your application, we'll look at FARs and recalls. We can also look at FARs and recalls that might not actually be specifically related to the product in the application, but it could generally summarize your overall quality management system too, so that could increase the risk. Production load. Is this facility listed in 25 different applications? If they all became approved in the next year, how would your systems handle that? Process risk. So what's the firm's related experience with the proposed operation? So is it a new or different process that we've never covered before at the facility? Is it a new manufacturing line, new building, new space? Obviously, we want to come take a look at that. A new profile. We can mitigate the risk a little bit amongst profiles. So if you have an immediate release, there's a couple examples up here. If you have an immediate release tablet, you're proposing an immediate release capsule of a similar drug load, we might be able to consider that a related profile and mitigate the risk there. Sometimes we can't mitigate the risk between an immediate release tablet because you have different drug loads. Also amongst process, say you have an immediate release tablet and you've been doing direct compression. Now you're proposing a lower drug load and you're going to do wet granulation. Well, that's going to increase the risk because we've never come take a closer look at that either. Also processes that are inherently difficult. We're seeing more applications with continuous manufacturing and novel processes. Product risk. So what were some of the product attributes that could increase the risk to the application? Some known issues to the RLD that we might be aware of that we might want to take a look at. A new molecular entity. The intended patient population. Is it an immunocompromised cancer patient and you have a sterile product? Sponsors first application, obviously there's some risk involved with that. And a complex supply chain. You have 15, 20 different facilities that all need to come together to make this product work. So here's some examples that trigger PAIs. They're kind of an automatic. Obviously if you don't have inspectional history or this facility is named for the first time in an application, we're going to come take a look at it. First generics don't always trigger a PAI, but it elevates the risk a little bit. Main point of this slide is a recent favorable surveillance inspection of an NAI or a VAI, and you've received the FMD 145 and your inspection's considered closed out. Doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to receive a PAI for a similar product. So pre-approval inspectors. Say we go through all our risks. It's a high risk, and we want to do a PAI, and we're going to come out and visit your facility. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the PAI inspection. We've had some previous talks in this forum about PAIs. They're available on the website, so you can go on. They're great talks. But I want to talk more about the process, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the back end. What happens in that gray area after the PAI is over and once you hear communication from us. So PAIs come from our office, the Office of Process and Facilities. They go to ORA. They create the assignment. They schedule the PAI. The inspection team may include ORA as the lead and center reviewers. I think you're going to see an increased trend of center reviewers being on these PAIs. We have intimate knowledge of the application, and it's a little bit more efficient for us to be on the inspection and look at some of the higher risk factors that we've considered. And they can come from any of the review divisions. If they can't make it to the PAI, we have a process called a knowledge transfer memo. We have a pre-inspectional meeting with the ORA investigators, and then we notify them of the concerns, and we'll transfer over items for them to follow up with on the inspection. So PAI is over. It was quick. The lead investigator will make a recommendation. They don't necessarily have to, but they can, if they don't find any significant violations of the PAI compliance program, and there's really no withholding criteria, they can recommend approval, which they'll refer back to the center. Or they can recommend withhold. So they observed something in the criteria of the compliance program. There's 3 objectives of the compliance program: conformance to the application, readiness for commercial manufacturing, and data integrity. Somewhere in your PAI you violated that. You were issued a 483 most likely, and they're going to recommend withhold. They can also recommend withhold based on GMP compliance situations. If there was a surveillance inspection covered with the PAI and they uncovered some issues, they can recommend withhold of the ANDA as well. Ultimately, though, what's important here is the final decision. They might recommend approval or withhold. At the time of the PAI, the final decision is held with the governing offices, though, OND, OGD. So after the PAI is over, this is this gray area that I was talking about, the inspection team writes the EIR narrative. They generate the package. If center reviewers were on the inspection too, they'll contribute to the EIR. Some of you might have received EIRs. We generally send them out after the inspection is considered closed. It's called an FMD 145. They'll include the exhibits, any of the attachments that they collected, any of the 483s they issued. That endorsed package is sent to the center. There's some small differences between domestic and foreign firms, and I'll get to that in a later slide. Generally, the final decision lies within OPF for PAIs. In our office, what we'll do is take the narrative report, we'll review it, we'll review any exhibits they collected pertinent to the PAI, any 483s that were issued, and then we're also going to determine your adequacy of your responses. So while we're reviewing that EIR, I just want to point out that we have a different type of information request, which is called a request for additional information. It's a little different from the normal information request that the applicant would receive from all the other review divisions. An RAI letter is basically an extension of the inspection. So if there was a 483 issued and your responses didn't quite adequately mitigate our risks to saying that it was okay, we can issue this letter to follow up. So we can request for specific SOPs. We can request the maybe the investigation that was started because of the 483 and any other data that you need to submit. That will become part of the official package of the inspection, reviewed, and then we'll determine adequacy. So I just wanted to point out that, and also what's important is that RAI letter is sent to the inspected facility. It's not sent to the applicant. And also RAIs and IRs can be used in tandem to ensure proper control strategy both in the application and at the facility that was inspected. So we can make sure that it's in the application and the facility has implemented it. So what are we going to do when we're finally analyzing all the PAI results? Well, the package, we're going to make sure that there was adequate coverage. They covered all 3 objectives of the compliance program I mentioned earlier. Any initial risks that were identified to the inspection team were covered and were adequately addressed. Or any additional items that were uncovered in the inspection. They might find some additional things. This whole time we're collaborating as the OPF representative, we're collaborating with the rest of the review team. So if they find issues with the analytical methods, I'm talking to the drug product reviewer. If they find issues with the in-process controls, I'm talking to the process reviewer, and we're making sure that we're on the same page. In a domestic facility here that resides in the United States, kind of the compliance end of it falls with your district pre-approval manager. Some of you may know your district pre-approval manager. They communicate a lot with facilities. But the important thing is, again, it falls with our office, the final decision, but we're working with the district pre-approval manager very closely. That may change. ORA is going through program alignment. We're not totally ready to roll out how district PAMs will fall into their drug programs, but they'll probably still be there. In an international facility, we at OPF, we are the compliance. We act as the compliance branch. So we're going to address your PAI specific concerns. Now when you have a GMP and a PAI inspection together, there can be crossover, but Normally GMP related 483s would be assessed by the Office of Surveillance, and then we're going to assess your product specific issues. Sometimes they cross over and we collaborate a lot. So wrapping up the facility review, this whole time as the facility review, we're kind of the liaison between ORA, what's going on at the facility, and the rest of the review team. So we're constantly communicating any PAI findings. We're communicating any compliance issues that arise over, if it's a 10-month review cycle, we're not in charge of when surveillance inspections happen. Any facilities are fluid, so compliance status can change. So we need to communicate that to the rest of the review team if something changes in one of the facilities. So when we wrap up our facility documentation, we're basically writing everything that I just talked about. We're going to talk about the initial risks that were identified. We're going to talk about our risk assessment, the facility process, the product risks that we identified. If we could mitigate them, we'll discuss that as well. For any PAIs that were conducted, we're going to talk about the risks that we communicated to the inspection team. Were those adequately addressed? Any 483s that were issued, how did the firm respond to those? How did they correct them? And then finally, the justification for the final facility recommendation. So then, the overall facility recommendation. So we're going to recommend approve of a facility if there's no significant or outstanding risk to the manufacturing process or final product based on the individual facilities, so every facility listed in there, and the composite evaluation of all the facilities listed. So we're going to recommend withhold if any one of the sites that you've listed in your application that we formally evaluate, if there's an enforcement action pending or has occurred, that the warning letter, basically if you're in OAI status, we can't approve. Or a recent surveillance inspection provides initial evidence of concerns with the currently marketed product. So again, that goes back to your surveillance inspections that can happen at any time. If you're late in the review cycle and you have some significant concerns addressed in 483s in a surveillance inspection and it's under the review process and you're in OAI status, we recommend withhold. And then most importantly from our office is product-specific issues that were uncovered during a PAI. The important part here is facility recommendations depend both on your surveillance, your GMP, and product-specific findings. So the overall approvability of the application, the facility portion of your application, may be affected by either one or both combined. I do want to bring up facility withdrawals. We did talk about it a little bit earlier, but from an OPF standpoint, we consider some factors. We see a lot of facility withdrawals, especially when facilities go into OAI status. Applicants want to take them out because they can't obtain approval without removing them. But we consider a lot of things. We don't just say, okay, let's take them out, but we consider the GMP status of the facility being withdrawn and what was the reason for that OAI status. If it was a data integrity issue, how did that potentially affect the application that we're reviewing? You have to identify who's going to take on that responsibility. So if it was originally listed as a control testing, stability testing facility, who's now going to take on the stability function? You have to maintain an integral supply chain. And obviously what data or information was generated to support the approval, and we're going to take that into factor. So there's some considerations down at the bottom here for all of you when you're withdrawing a facility. So in summary, the assessment considers the risks from a GMP perspective as well as a review perspective, including the whole OPQ review team's findings to ensure a holistic assessment. And again, we identify the initial risks proposed in the application. We're looking at your compliance history and your relevancy to that product. How can your facility adequately implement that product and determine whether or not a PAI should be done to take a closer look and support the review of the application. and then we finally make the commercial acceptability of each facility. And ultimately, what we're deciding is what degree of confidence do we have in OPF that the facility can perform the outlined responsibilities and functions within a state of control over the life cycle of the product. So it's not only at the time of approval, but it's down the road as well. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, our last speaker for this afternoon is Dr. Stevens-Riley. Dr. Stevens-Riley is currently a Master Microbiology Reviewer in the Division of Microbiology Assessment in the Office of Process and Facilities in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. Previously, she was